Okay, welcome back for our evening session. We have a great panel tonight to talk about housing issues with Councilmember Will Jawando, who's been a leader on missing middle housing. We have one of our former STAR staff members, Aaron Day, coming out from the West Coast, and a whole bunch of other really exciting and knowledgeable people. So I'm going to hand it straight over to Jason Sartori to introduce everybody and kick it off so we can get right to it.
Great. Thank you and good evening. As Chair Anderson indicated, my name is Jason Sartori, and I am the Chief of the Countywide Planning and Policy Division at the Montgomery County Planning Department. I'm really excited about this item on the Planning Board's agenda today. When the board held its last work session on the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative on December 9th, we received direction from the board to pull together a panel of experts working on similar issues across the country. And that is why we are here this evening. We have an outstanding panel that can talk about efforts being pursued by HUD in the state of Oregon, next door in Arlington, Virginia, and in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We have folks working on policy at a local and national level, as well as someone working on the ground to expand housing types. I'll introduce each of the panelists in turn later, but let me give you a real quick rundown of how we're going to proceed this evening. In a couple of seconds, I'm going to hand the mic over to our good friend and partner in policy, Councilmember Will Jawando, who introduced ZTA 2007 in December 2020. That ZTA was really the impetus for the effort we currently know as the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative. Councilmember Jawando will give a few introductory remarks, and then I will ask our project manager, Lisa Gavoni, to provide a real quick summary of where we are with the AHS effort. It's been a couple of months, and I think we all, the board, our staff, our panelists, and the public could probably use a real quick refresher. And then I'll introduce each of the panelists who will present for 5 to 10 minutes each about their respective efforts. And after each of the panelists have presented, I'll moderate a Q&A session with questions our staff has prepared and culled from community submissions, with questions from the board members interspersed as well. So without any further delay, I would like to welcome Councilmember Jawando to the virtual mic to provide some brief introductory remarks. Councilmember Jawando is an at-large member of the County Council, first elected in 2018. He's a member of the Council's Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee and Education and Culture Committee, where he is the lead for libraries. Councilmember.
Thank you, Mr. Sartori. It's good to see you guys. And as I said in private, I'll say in public, I love the new building. It was a great investment, and I'm jealous of your dais. I have to come visit you guys over there. And I appreciate the intro about being a part of the impetus for the discussion, but you all have been working on this for multiple years, doing a lot of research, and obviously the Silver Spring plan that's come to us has portions of this, and I know your commissioners and have worked on that, particularly Partap Verma and others. So it's a collaborative effort, and so we can share both the credit and the blame. That comes when you try to do things differently, but it's needed. And I say that jokingly, but also very seriously, because as you all know, the housing crisis is astronomical. The costs are astronomical. We don't have enough housing. We don't have enough housing at different price points. We don't have different types of housing. And that's part of what we're here to discuss tonight. Is innovative strategies from across the country that have led to more types of housing or have had hiccups, right? You know, one of the reasons I was so happy to help invite my good friend Lisa Bender, who's now free from the shackles of public service in a formal way, but has been laboring and toiling in the fields in Minneapolis for many, many years. And she's a good friend and really a mentor in that she had been serving for longer than I. You know, they had taken bold steps in this area but didn't necessarily see all the, as I'm sure she'll talk about, the results they wanted. And there were hiccups. And this is a new type of challenge for us. And so I'm really interested to hear from Arlington and from the federal level and the incentives there and from Aaron out in Oregon. I just think this is a critical discussion to be having right now, especially as we come out of this pandemic and are trying to recover, trying to ensure that people are stable in their homes for safety reasons, for their students to be less mobile and to learn and know all that they've gone through over the last 2 years, for our seniors to be able to age in place for our kids, my kids, your grandkids, to be able to live here in a great county that we call home. One of the most diverse, home to 4 of the top 10 most diverse cities in the country. This is a place that people want to be, and we should allow people to be here. And attainable housing, missing middle housing is a part of that strategy. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to work everywhere. Some places it's going to look different. And I think this is a part of that learning and discussion of how we can learn and how we can change MyZTA, change other proposals as we move forward with our general plan update here, as we move forward with trying to achieve more housing for more people and look at the whole range of things that can deliver that. And so I'm really excited to hear from the panel and learn and get right to work later this year, working with my colleagues, working with the planning department to try to implement and learn from what has happened in other places and see how we can do something here to really help people to be able to stay here and to move here. So really excited about the conversation and really appreciate all the panelists taking time out of their schedule to do it on a what is this, a Thursday evening? And happy Black History Month. So thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Councilmember Jawando, for helping to set the stage here this evening. I know that we frequently get to crash council meetings, so it's great to shake things up a bit and have you join us during this planning board meeting. And now I'd like to ask Lisa Gavoni, the Planning Department's lead housing planner and project manager for the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative, to give a quick refresher on where we are with that effort and the board's recommendations. Lisa?
Thanks, Jason. So good evening, everyone. My name is Lisa Gavoni, and I'm with the Countywide Planning and Policy Division. Before we get into the panel discussion, I want to give a brief, I want to give a brief overview. Sorry, hold on one second. My the PowerPoint went away in my screen. So 1 second. All right, sorry, much better. So before we get into the panel discussion, I want to give a brief overview of the Planning Board's Attainable Housing Strategies recommendations to provide some context. In short, to give a little bit of history to the initiative, the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative is one in which the Planning Department and Planning Board evaluated and refined proposals and developed recommendations to allow more diverse types of housing in more parts of the county. The initiative is the result of a county council request for the planning board to consider, and I quote, zoning reforms to allow greater opportunities for missing middle housing in Montgomery County. And that's what we've been working on for the past year, believe it or not. And so our approach to attainable housing has really focused on 3 scales: small, medium, and large. And with these 3 distinct types of attainable housing comes 3 distinct sets of housing typologies with distinct planning board recommendations and implementation tools, and each with its own geographic focus. For small scale, the board is focused on allowing house-size multi-unit structures like duplexes within the interior of our single-family neighborhoods. The planning board is recommending allowing the creation of duplexes and triplexes in many neighborhoods that currently only allow single-family detached units by right, and conformance with a pattern book will be required. Also, for small scale, the planning board is also recommending establishing what we're calling a priority housing district, which is surrounding key transit stations and corridors, which will allow reduced parking requirements in the construction of quadplexes and more walkable neighborhoods. And for the medium scale structures like small apartment buildings, the planning board is recommending creating a new attainable housing optional method of development to spark medium density and more diverse types of buildings like small apartment buildings and stack flats along our residential corridors. And finally, our larger scale, this includes taller apartment buildings and live-work buildings. The board is recommending that we pursue these products by leveraging the master plan process to identify opportunities for rezoning properties along the county's primary corridors to allow higher density residential development. And finally, just to highlight some next steps for initiative. Like I said, we've been working on this for what will be a year, actually next week. And so we're excited that we will potentially have a final work session on zoning modifications in early April. And we will also discuss to finalize the draft report. Now I will turn it over to Mr. Sartori to lead the discussion and panel.
Thank you, Lisa. It's crazy to think that it's been a year, but as Councilmember Jawando said, really a lot of this is based off of work that we've been doing here in the Planning Department and research we've done for a number of years on housing and housing policy. So, okay, at this time, I'd like to introduce our first panelist. Since joining the Department of Housing and Urban Development in 2000, Dr. Regina Gray's research activities have ranged from sustainable development, urban design and land use planning, transit-oriented development, energy and green building practices, environmental justice, and affordable housing preservation. She's been the project manager for several HUD initiatives related to coordinated housing and transportation planning and methodologies for siting affordable housing developments in high-opportunity communities. Dr. Gray has written articles on regulatory barriers to affordable housing and co-authored articles with the AARP and the EPA on aging-in-place strategies. Currently, she's working to implement HUD's Climate Action Plan and to develop a strategy for addressing capital needs in HUD's public housing portfolio. Dr. Gray earned a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Emory University, a Master of Arts in Political Science and Public Policy from the Georgetown University, and a doctorate in Political Science and Policy Studies from the University of Maryland in College Park. Dr. Gray, welcome. The virtual floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I hope that you can see me. I got a bit of a change in my computer here, so I hope you can see and hear me okay. I have prepared a presentation for you, so let me just bring it up here. Should have been right there. Okay. All right.
We can see it.
So I have a lot of information to share with you this evening, and thank you so much. I'm going to try to get through everything in 10 minutes, but the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to start the discussion by addressing three primary challenges that we face and so some potential solutions based on research and also activity at the federal level, and specifically HUD and the work that we've been doing at the department. So I'm going to look at three primary challenges. The first is land use zoning practices that create barriers in the market and price out potential homeowners and renters, particularly those that we're talking about as far as a paucity of housing choice in the middle market or moderate income housing. I'm going to discuss how the Not in My Backyard movement and resistance to change has constrained building types and options for low and moderate income families. And then finally, I am going to touch a little bit on some of the challenges we're facing in the supply chain, financing and construction, the impacts that it has had on the cost of labor and the cost of doing business in general. And then we'll discuss some potential solutions, and then I'll save some specific information for the discussion. So first, land use zoning practices. We have found that zoning practices can constrain housing supply. They can artificially raise prices and reduce affordability, and they also place limits on diversity. Our research has shown that the constraints on housing supply is drastic. Historically, the majority of residential land use in the United States has been zoned primarily for single-family detached homes. Our research has shown that the areas with the lowest density or low density only zoning allows only 1 to 5 units per acre, and then that reduces the supply of rental housing that could be developed per acre. We believe that zoning that allows for a variety of housing types is associated with a greater quality and quantity of low-cost rental housing, as well as a greater supply of units that are not affordable. So our goal is to expand the supply of moderate income housing, and there's several solutions to this. Comprehensive plans should specify the goals of housing types as well as the density targets when planning for future growth. And we see that in the future, we can expect population growth to expand exponentially, and we need to plan for that. What exclusionary housing practices do is we've found that they artificially raise prices and reduce affordability. Minimum lot size requirements add to the cost of housing, And based on work that we've done, looking at comparative surveys of local land use regulations across the US, housing markets found that minimum lot size restrictions are more severe today than they were a decade ago. Minimum lot size restrictions exist in at least one neighborhood in 94% of communities across the United States, and 39% have minimum lot size restrictions of 1 acre or more. Site restrictions within the zoning code can impact housing affordability. We have found, for instance, that parking requirements, in terms of parking requirements, renters often pay for parking despite vehicle ownership. They pay more. A national study found that garage parking increased rents by 17%. And another study that we found that one parking spot per unit increased the cost of housing by 12.5%. We are looking tonight at the limitations on the diversity of housing types. What we are finding is that the decades of zoning policies that discourage or ban small-scale, higher-density housing have contributed to the missing middle gap. And this is reducing housing choice and placing a particular burden on low and moderate income families. Single-family zoning and maximum density limits often block diverse housing types that support households of varying incomes and ages. And then we look at the impact that exclusionary zoning practices has on our goal to increase racial equity. Redlining policies discriminated against people of color, communities of color, by denying them access to mortgages, primarily in the areas with African American residents. So what are some of the strategies that we can look to promote housing affordability through changes in our zoning policies and practices? One, we can establish or expand zones where higher density multifamily housing is allowed by right, and particularly near transit. Two, we can establish zones that allow for a variety of housing types in areas that can support light densification, such as accessory dwelling units. And I've learned that Montgomery County has just passed recently a very ambitious and innovative ADU ordinance. But thinking about how these different housing types can add to the options for affordable housing for residents. And the last thing we can do is zone to reduce minimum lot size requirements and reduce unit sizes. We can also reduce parking requirements, as we'll see across the country, some examples that we have identified. We can allow by right approval. We can implement lot size averaging. And we can create opportunities to reposition vacant or underutilized properties as housing. And finally, leverage publicly owned land for affordable housing trusts, or a combination of affordable housing trusts and other shared equity practices that can be implemented. And deploy right of first refusal policies. Land use policies are inherently local. So you are asking me what the federal government can do to incentivize, land use reform. First, in my job as a researcher, we can support research to understand the long-term impacts of land use policies on residential neighborhoods and across cities. We can create a centralized source of data on land use regulations to gain a better understanding of the national picture of zoning and land use practices and the cost on housing. And then we have been doing very recently convening expert stakeholders who have successfully implemented changes to share their land use and zoning policies and practices, and learning from the local governments about some of the strategies that have been implemented to address exclusionary zoning practices. Turning to Nimbyism really quickly, and I'm so happy to see Lisa Bender, who has joined us this evening to talk about how Nimbyism was overcome in Minneapolis. We know that Nimbyism is defined as resident opposition to housing development in or near their community. And there are communities that limit housing development by public approval processes that block development, land use controls, excessive regulatory requirements, discriminatory practices, and ongoing bias against residents of affordable housing. In the homeowner sector, we are learning more about the appraisal industry and disparate impacts on race and communities in that sector. How does it impact the construction and attainment of affordable housing development? So we've been looking at several research studies, and we found one in New York State that found that nearly 75% experienced some form of opposition on one or more projects, and that is contributed to construction delays, aesthetic improvements, denial of approvals, changes in location and prevention of the project altogether, leasing and sale delays, permitting delays, damaging reputation, and decrease in unit size, all leading to impacts and constraints on housing type and adding to housing costs. So how do we get to yes? Local and state jurisdictions can facilitate communication between developers and community members prior to public hearings, regularly assess housing needs and land use policies to accommodate expected growth, and advocate for affordable housing with public officials and community members. At the federal level, we think that we can incentivize more affordable housing and getting to yes through some of our programs, such as the Community Development Block Grant Program and the Home Investment Program, whereby communities can utilize funds for various activities around housing, redevelopment, and strategies connecting housing and transportation, for example. What is HUD's role? HUD's role is to provide a national platform to convene local stakeholders and experts to share solutions to NIMBY opposition. I did mention that we have created roundtable discussions to share lessons learned on successful strategies to combat NIMBYism, and that we need to promote a persuasive narrative that will provide a clear vision for the expansion of affordable housing and affordable housing options. I'm going to turn very quickly to financing affordable housing, which is the second challenge, or the third challenge, I should say, that I'm addressing tonight. And there are a number of strategies that we think where we can move the ball forward at the federal, state, and local levels to implement and mitigate the impacts of barriers to the financing of affordable housing. We can engage partners to achieve objectives, deploying a robust communication system to engage investors with housing advocacy groups and government entities to build capacity and fund affordable housing projects. We can support the use of expansion of flexible, innovative funding sources. The LIHTC program, low-income housing tax credit program, for example, is one such program that is used in collaboration or in leveraging other funding sources to create very creative and innovative approaches to expanding affordable housing investments. What else can we do at the federal level? We can align and standardize programs and procedures, align and simplify the administrative requirements of federal affordable housing programs, and ensure staffing levels are sufficient to process work and oversee agency portfolios. We can modernize and streamline the process required under environmental procurement, waste, fraud, abuse prevention, and look more closely at the impacts of Davis-Bacon regulations on promoting affordable housing developments and impacts therein. And we can improve data gathering and analysis capabilities, improving federal data collection and reporting systems, including the LIHTC system. Touching on construction and the barriers and solutions at the federal level. Some of the challenge that we face here, and most of you understand what we are dealing with in terms of the supply chain, the cost of construction. We're finding that construction costs increase when building codes are not standardized. The housing construction industry has told us and has reported to us that poor coordination and conflicts between governing bodies persist, Inconsistent regulatory requirements across federal, state, and local jurisdictions persist. So for HUD, we oversee the HUD code manufactured housing, which is off-site construction, same as modular housing, except for HUD governs the codes and regulations therein. But we can streamline those processes to make off-site construction available and more palatable for low and income families. And we can reduce the complexity in those layers of regulations at the federal level, including Federal Housing Administration regulations and requirements. We can look at restrictive building codes that impede innovation and create barriers to mass production. And we can do a better job promoting health and safety with respect to HUD code manufactured housing, which we are looking at now. And we can improve the process of updating regulations that lag behind technological advances in housing construction. I'm just going to share with you really quickly best practice solutions. We cite the state of Maryland's Building Rehabilitation Code that streamlines code requirements for the rehabilitation of existing housing. We can eliminate costly restrictions on the construction process. We cite Texas House Bill 2439, which prohibits local restrictions on building materials and that could result in lower construction costs for buyers and builders. And then we can standardize and streamline regulatory approval processes. The Maricopa Association of Government Building Codes, for example, made recommendations on how building codes are developed, interpreted, and enforced. We can support the use of technically advanced and cost-effective materials, the safe construction of mass timber building, looking at timber and other technologies. The International Code Council is looking at sort of expanding this and reducing some of the requirements around mass timber that can help reduce the cost. And we can foster construction innovation. The Building Innovations Database Project was expanded in 2016 to become a nationwide resource for high-performing green building innovations. At HUD, we are really trying to push the envelope forward in building innovation and building science. There are a few events that are upcoming this summer that I will mention later on, but for now, pushing the envelope on housing and building technologies and reducing some of the code requirements or streamlining some of the code requirements that can impede innovation. And I'm going to stop there. I can make this presentation available if preferred, but I wanted to thank everybody again for allowing me an opportunity to share some of our efforts with you this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Regina. That was fantastic.
That was fantastic.
It's always really great to see such strong leadership on housing policy and research from our friends at the federal government, and to know what a great resource and partner you are for local jurisdictions. So thank you. Our next panelist is Lisa Bender from the city of Minneapolis in Minnesota. Ms. Bender is a former member and president of the Minneapolis City Council who championed creating more attainable housing options through single-family zoning reform. She was council president when the city council voted to eliminate single-family zoning throughout Minneapolis in 2018. At the time, single-family zones accounted for nearly 70% of the city's total land area. In addition to housing policy, Ms. Bender has supported racial equity and climate resilience efforts by leading the adoption of the Minneapolis 2040 Plan and the city's $400 million investment in Complete Streets and Vision Zero. Prior to taking office, she had over a decade of experience working in the planning field in the areas of transportation and land use policies. Ms. Bender has a master's degree in city and regional planning from UC Berkeley. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you all. It's great to be here. And as was mentioned, I'm a trained city planner. So of course, we all learn about your groundbreaking work in Montgomery County on transit-oriented development, and you have been a leader in this space for a very long time. So it's an honor to be here to share some of our experiences in Minneapolis. I'm going to give a presentation that tells a little bit of the story of our work in housing over the past 8 years. So I just retired from politics, very happily enjoying some time with my family now. But I was on the city council for 8 years. And in the middle of that time, just after our last election, I helped lead the adoption of this very big comprehensive plan, as well as a number of smaller but significant zoning changes, budget investments, and other policies related to transportation, housing. And so, I expect you to hear some similarities and some differences. So I'll move maybe a bit quickly through the details, but I have them there in case there are questions that you have for me at the end about our experience in Minneapolis. So I'll share my screen and grab this presentation. Share screen. There we go. And slideshow. Okay, is that working?
Yes, we see it.
Great, okay. So like I said, I'll plan to tell you the story of our Minneapolis 2040 plan adoption that was adopted at the end of 2018. We adopted zoning code changes leading up to, during, and after the development of that plan. It's kind of an iterative process for us to look at specific changes as well as this big, very strategic, holistic view of all of our city's policies and how they're affecting the day-to-day life in our city. So both that policy change and the results that we've seen in the community have been very incremental. If you take anything away from what I talk about, it would be that theme that the change has been very slow. And I'll speak more about that in detail. We were very intentional about our goals, and particularly centering around race equity, and really being able to couch these specific changes in the context of a big comprehensive plan was important for us to really ground in those values and goals, as well as to track our progress over time. And I think that's really important in housing policy in particular. As Dr. Gray talked about, housing policy is, it's touching a private market. We're regulating a market. We're licensing rental housing. So unlike transportation or infrastructure where we have direct control, here we're interacting in a private market. And so, often when I would make a proposal for housing policy change, we would hear two kinds of resistance. One kind would be a lot of fear about change coming too quickly. For example, our inclusionary zoning policy, developers said, we'll never develop housing in Minneapolis again if you require affordable housing. When we proposed to allow for triplexes, folks were very afraid that there would be bulldozers coming in to tear down whole neighborhoods. So that one theme was a fear of very rapid change. But the other theme that we hear often at the same time is a fear that things won't change enough, that simply changing our zoning or adopting one policy won't really get us to where we need to go. And I have found over this time that the second one tends to be more true. It tends to be more true that we're not quite getting the results that we want to achieve equity in our community than it is that these very dramatic changes happen very quickly. So I always want to acknowledge when I speak to folks in other communities that we have a lot of similar dynamics, a lot of similar challenges across the country, but of course each community is unique. You are experts in your own experience. For us, it was really important to ensure that we were hearing the voices of our whole community, so that public engagement process was really important for us. Our plan was required, and so we had a little bit of an advantage in some ways because we had a definite deadline where we had to finish this plan and adopt our policies to submit it to our regional planning agency. It's required under state law. So if you do not have a forced deadline, it can be a little harder, I think, to take that definitive action at the end. I always encourage folks to try, though, to set a deadline and really stick to it. It's one way to be really honest with the folks who are taking time from your community to get involved, because if you keep, delaying, which often happens here, it's really hard for people to track what is happening and make sure their voice is getting heard. So we had the advantage of an externally imposed deadline. So the Minneapolis 2040 plan, adopted in 2018, allowed a minimum of up to 3 units of housing on any lot in the city. So we legalized that kind of small multifamily housing that was previously banned in 70% of our area. It also supports new housing in all neighborhoods, focused near transit, along the model that you have been using for a long time. It includes new requirements for affordable housing and goals for green building standards. Overall, the plan had 100 policies that were connected to 14 goals. We got a lot of national interest in the triplexes piece in particular, but it is a small piece of this much bigger plan. Minneapolis at the time was and still is a growing city. We did not have enough homes for the people who wanted to live here. We lacked a variety of housing options for larger immigrant families, for seniors who wanted to age in place, and we had very dramatic racial disparities in housing. We're a majority renter city, just barely 52% of people rent their homes, and in a tight housing market, renters were under a lot of pressure. There was a lot of displacement happening and a lot of stress. And this was all before COVID times, which have, of course, exacerbated a lot of these dynamics. For us, focusing on race equity was imperative. We have some of the best quality of life indicators in the country, and at the same time, some of the worst racial disparities in the country. It's a shameful reality of both in Minneapolis and statewide in Minnesota, and something that we're very committed to correcting. So it was important for us to be really honest from the beginning that we were tackling a pattern and system of racial exclusion in housing that had been codified over time in our local laws. We took a look at the maps, and we saw that those redlining maps that the federal government so famously used, that people, think about as racial exclusion, were codified in our local zoning code. So that at our public meetings, we showed folks maps, and we can still see today that pattern in our land use and our zoning, and as well in our outcomes that our community is seeing. So it isn't a surprise when we see data that shows huge racial disparities in housing in our community. It's part of a pattern that was codified over time, both in federal lending and in banking discrimination, but also in our local land use laws. So, as I was saying, our racial disparities are very significant. Households of color are disproportionately cost burden in our city, and also tend to be a higher percentage renter. So because we update our comprehensive plan every 10 years, we have had the benefit of making changes over time. This was a very significant update to our plan, but it was also building on a commitment to focusing growth near transit and some other kind of longer policies that had been developed over time. And again, I said this at the beginning, but I'll emphasize it again. For us, it was important to both have this vision to ground ourselves in our values, and then each of these different zoning code changes that we made, at this point, a dozen of them, was really important to getting to that overall goal. Taken in themselves, each one, certainly didn't solve the whole problem itself. So making sure that we had this all moving together at relatively the same time helped us answer some of those questions about effectiveness. So before we adopted the comprehensive plan, we did some policy changes that helped lay the groundwork for this commitment. We legalized accessory dwelling units citywide. At the time, we compromised and only allowed them in owner-occupied homes. It probably wasn't legal, but it was what we could get through the council at the time. We reduced parking requirements near transit, similar to the proposed ordinance that you're looking at, the zoning code amendment that you're looking at. We took a walk shed. We did a quarter mile from high-frequency bus and a half mile from fixed rail. Our rail system is not as robust. We also, at the same time, we were looking at transportation investments, worker protections, all of these things that really go together to build the kind of inclusive city that we know the majority of our residents want. And then at the same time, we're doing community engagement around our comprehensive plan, which was adopted in 2018. Since then, we have been able to do changes both thoughtfully, but with less kind of standalone community engagement for each and every zoning code change. So we were able to legalize triplexes citywide at the same time we passed the plan. We took away that owner requirement from accessory dwelling units. We adopted citywide inclusionary zoning for market rate projects. That was the first time we've ever required affordable housing in market rate units. It's phasing in incrementally, especially for those smaller 20 to 50 unit buildings. We've legalized cluster developments, which helped us open a emergency shelter during COVID, and single room occupancy residences, which is helping us partner with our county to open shelter and longer term supportive housing in hotels that have become vacant during the pandemic. And then we've also been able to really leverage all of these other programs and policies to fit in with our overall housing policy strategies. And we've passed significant renter protections. We have a renter first policy that directs our regulatory services department to really leverage their licensing function to support renters' health and safety. We passed a notice of building sale ordinance with some protections for renters. We limited look back for eviction and criminal history. We passed a right to counsel. We passed a charter amendment to allow for rent control or rent stabilization policy, as well as we're looking at tenant opportunity to purchase policy as well. We didn't get that one done before I left. So like I said, we committed to a really inclusive process. We tried to set and stick to a deadline and to really provide for our staff who are working so hard on this certainty in that process, as well as for the public. We did a bunch of community meetings. We engaged with kids. We went out to street festivals. Like I said, we had an election, so we had to really be careful with how we were interacting, both with the community as well as with candidates. Obviously became very political. There was a lot of debate. There were lawn signs. There was a lot of fear and headlines. But really, at the end of the day, we kept focusing back on those goals. And there was a huge amount of alignment between different organizations that focus on issue areas from workers to renter protections to racial justice, really all started to coalesce in support of this vision and plan. So the final plan passed 12-1, just one council member held out in the end. For us, it was really important. We're a fully built out urban area. We don't have any kind of more traditional suburban areas. So for us, it was really important to include the whole city in one comprehensive strategy. So while we made some specific amendments based on feedback from council members, we didn't carve out any particular areas that were completely exempt from these changes. And so, like I said, we've implemented lots of different ordinances, transportation policies, budget investments. Housing staff is tracking progress by giving an annual update at the City Council, as well as they have an inclusionary zoning dashboard that's available for the public to track that policy change. And this is the big takeaway. We legalized duplexes and triplexes as accessory dwelling units, and that has been very incremental. So for those first couple of years, 60 duplexes and 15 triplexes were added across the city of just over 400,000 people. And then this is our housing construction. And so we have seen an uptick in investment in housing. More housing has been built. There has been some change, of course, because of the pandemic, but it hasn't been a huge change. And actually, we've seen a lot. The biggest change has been in seeing more of these, 20 to 100 unit buildings, these smaller buildings that were not permitted before because of parking requirements or setback requirements. They have essentially been made illegal. So that is my overview, and I'm happy to answer questions as we go. And I'll see if I can stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you, Lisa. It's really interesting to see so many similarities, really, in your effort with ours from a planning context, especially as we're actively engaged in updating our general plan with many of the same themes that you talked about, with many of the same connections that you discussed. I can also tell you that there's been great interest here in Montgomery County on the reforms that you adopted in Minneapolis, and so we really appreciate your leadership in this arena. Next, we have someone a little closer to home. Ms. Kelly Brown is a comprehensive planning supervisor in the Arlington County Planning Division. She has over 15 years of experience as a planner in both the public and private sectors. Her current work focuses on leading a team of planners conducting long-range planning studies, small area plans, and expanding housing choice initiatives, including Arlington County's Missing Middle Housing Study, scheduled to be completed later this year. Ms. Brown's career has included positions with Arlington's Comprehensive Planning Team, the county's Neighborhood Conservation Section, and consulting work for real estate and economic development clients. She holds a Bachelor's of Science degree from Georgetown University and a Master of Community Planning degree from the University of Maryland, where I had the great pleasure of being one of her classmates. So, Kelly, welcome back north of the Potomac.
Thank you, Jason. It's great to be here. I'm really honored that you invited me to your session tonight. Across the river in Arlington, we've been following closely what Montgomery County has been doing. Like Jason said, I've been part of Arlington's Missing Middle Housing Study since we kicked it off through the development of a research compendium and a pre-planning process and a formal kickoff in 2020. So we've come a long journey, and we're still not quite there yet, but I'm looking forward to sharing with you what we've done so far and where we're headed. So I just want to make sure you can see my slides. Are they up there yet? Not yet. You can see that now. All right. There we go. We all set?
Yep.
Okay, great. So here to just talk a little bit about what we're doing in our Missing Middle Housing Study, which we also refer to as the Expanding Housing Choice Study for Arlington County. Fundamentally, Arlington's Missing Middle Housing Study is about expanding housing choice. So we're exploring how allowing other housing choices could potentially meet a wider range of household housing needs. And these are options that are really in short supply, options that have been diminishing over time. Looking at smaller housing options with lower housing costs, starter homes, kind of that sweet spot of 3-bedroom units. It's easy to find a 1 or a 2-bedroom unit in a multifamily building. Now you can find a 6 or 7-bedroom house as a product of our kind of tear down and rebuild phenomenon. Accessibility, private open space. So these are all housing options, housing needs that we're looking to address through our study. And so you're probably very familiar with this graphic, but this is what we use in Arlington to really help explain, the strategy that we're trying to employ through this effort. So looking at a range of housing types in the middle between single-family detached homes and mid and high-rise buildings that can meet some of these needs that are currently hard to address through single detached homes or mid and high-rise apartment buildings. And something that's really important to try to emphasize as we're speaking with the community is that missing middle housing really does refer to the size, not the price. So we're not trying to meet a specific income segment. However, these housing types can be less expensive than a single family household home. And this graphic really helps illustrate the challenges we face. So Arlington does have a wide variety of housing options, but thanks to barriers put in place in our zoning ordinance over time, the legacy we now have as a result of our exclusionary zoning, we experience the same thing that has been realized, that we've come to realize is a phenomenon across the country in terms of exclusionary zoning and land use policy. We face very limited options in the middle that can meet these needs. And this study is also exploring how change managed thoughtfully could positively impact Arlington's future. So something that's important to realize is that the supply of smaller homes that could meet a variety of household needs is going away as these smaller homes are being replaced by larger units allowed by right in our zoning ordinance. These new homes meet a certain segment of the population, but they're also causing a lot of other problems. loss of lower cost housing choices, and environmental concerns such as loss of tree canopy and stormwater management challenges resulting from increases in impervious surface. So the study has been divided up into 3 phases in Arlington, and we have just completed the first phase, which was designed to be a predominantly community engagement phase where we were seeking input from the community on trying to get a common understanding of what are the community's key priorities and concerns in expanding housing choice. We also used phase 1 as an opportunity to identify some housing types that we thought we could study in more detail to fit into the Arlington context, and then use those community priorities and concerns as a framework for studying these housing types. So we produced a report at the end of last year and shared it with our county board, documenting what we heard and our recommendations for specific housing types to study. And so we are now in phase 2, really diving into the details of some specific housing types, in the process of developing some recommendations for which housing types we'd like to recommend and where they would be most appropriate. Looking forward to sharing those recommendations with the community this spring, getting feedback, and then sharing those final recommendations with our county board this summer. With their feedback, looking forward to moving then to phase 3, which would be our implementation phase, developing zoning ordinance amendments and potentially other new policies, recommendations for other future studies and efforts that might be needed to support our goals for expanding housing choice. So in terms of the community priorities that we did hear from the community in phase 1, it really coalesced around 5 major themes. So by and large, reducing housing costs, adding more supply, and adding housing options was the front runner in terms of a priority for this effort. However, we also heard a lot about the importance of conserving tree canopy and maintaining connections to nature. So preserving those the key features of Arlington that make it a special place. Achieving a more sustainable land use pattern, so really capitalizing on our proximity to the nation's capital, our proximity to a huge job center and transit. Also, the importance of investing in schools and infrastructure to keep pace with growth. And then finally, not only on the topic of maintaining connections to nature, but maintaining the other features of our community that make it so special. Diversity, making sure we keep our diverse community, connections with neighbors, and building upon that tradition of walkability that makes Arlington a great place to be. And so I mentioned our report at the end of phase 1 also recommended specific housing types to study in phase 2, and that's where we are now. We're looking at a specific menu of housing types, not too different from what our, Montgomery County is looking at, specifically single detached homes on smaller lots, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and other small multiplexes up to 8 units, and then townhouses. And as we study these housing types, we're really looking at a fairly comprehensive scope of analysis. So we're starting off looking at different design options for these different housing types, how they could be designed in a way that really fits within the Arlington context. We're also trying to understand the economic feasibility of these options. So what is the likely pace of growth? What are the price points? These are really important questions to answer, and we have the resources of some consultants to help us answer those questions. We're also looking to see how, again, considering the community's priorities and concerns, what are the opportunities and impacts of expanding housing choice? What are the appropriate locations? We understand that not all these housing types might be appropriate in the right places, so we're looking at things such as proximity to transit, as is the case in Montgomery County, as well as other factors. And then evaluating our recommendations through an equity lens is also very important. Who would stand to benefit? Who would potentially be burdened? Who's left out from these recommendations? And then how should we refine our recommendations to make them more equitable? So phase 2 is really all about answering several key questions. Number 1, where should housing types, new housing types, or existing housing types be made more flexible? How could expanded housing choice meet community priorities? How do we balance priorities and concerns? What are the trade-offs? How do the expected outcomes of new policies compare with today's business as usual approach, where you can and pretty much just only build a single family house in a lot of places, and the consequences of that option alone? And then what are the design parameters that best support allowing these housing types within Arlington neighborhoods? So we're very much looking forward to bringing our recommendations to the community. We will be relying on a broad spectrum of engagement strategies, really focused on trying to reach those that we don't traditionally reach those that stand to benefit from expanded housing choice, and in any engagement we conduct, trying to make sure we have the most diverse cross-section of our community involved, listening to one another, hearing different perspectives. So again, we're looking forward to hearing from the community, refining our recommendations, and bringing them to the county board this summer. And with that, I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you about our study. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. It's really helpful, I think, for folks in Montgomery County tuning in this evening to know that we are not alone in the region in our efforts to expand housing options. So we're now going to virtually fly across the country to hear from our final panelist. Ms. Erin Day is currently the real estate director at Dev Northwest, a community-based economic development corporation located in Western Oregon. As the real estate director, Ms. Day strategically manages Dev Northwest's existing asset portfolio as well as drives its real estate development pipeline. Dev Northwest's real estate development team is not only spearheading the affordable home ownership development effort in Oregon, but has also successfully integrated a variety of missing middle housing typologies into its portfolio to increase housing access for Oregonians at all income levels. Ms. Day earned her master's degree in real estate from Georgetown University and is also currently a licensed independent clinical social worker in the state of Oregon. She serves on several land use committees across the state and is an elected member of the executive committee for her local neighborhood association in Southwest Eugene. Prior to moving to Oregon, as the chair mentioned earlier, Ms. Day used to work here at the Montgomery Planning Department, so we welcome you back, Erin.
Thanks, Jason. It's really exciting to be here, and I'm also really excited to have heard all of the presentations before mine, so I have a pretty good context. I think my role primarily on this panel is to talk about things from kind of the developer side. What does it look like when some of these legislative movements have passed, and when you're actually trying to get these units on the ground, and making sure that the policies that are going in place are effective, and that the pattern that you were hoping to establish actually gets established in the market. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully it will allow me to do that. Screen share. Looks like, yeah, let me just move this over. Can everybody see my screen? Okay. I'm gonna assume that's a yes.
Not yet. Oh, there, it's coming, I think. There you go.
All right, awesome. So as Jason mentioned, I'm primarily here to talk about my role as a developer, but in 2019, Oregon passed HB 2001, which allowed duplexes, triplexes, and a variety of other housing typologies in single-family zones. And so that was a statewide legislative action. So after that was passed, the legislation allowed for local jurisdictions to create local standards. And so the bill passed in 2019, but they had until July 2022, so that's coming up now, for local jurisdictions to adopt standards above the minimum standards that were set at the state. So while this legislation has passed, and there's definitely development on the ground that we're engaging in and working with, local jurisdictions have until July of this year to adopt additional standards based on specific needs for their communities. So things related to parking and infrastructure and other issues that might be more local concerns. So as a developer in the state, I've been serving on several planning action committees across the state, helping to implement this HB 2001 local code. So that's just a different hat and different perspective on kind of implementing these policies. I'm also on the state of Oregon's affordability task force. And as Jason remembered, I'm an elected member of my neighborhood association. So I get to handle all the land use activity. So in my role at Dev Northwest, so Dev Northwest is a community economic development corporation. So we do residential, commercial, and mixed use projects. We do everything from low income all the way to market rate projects. We also straddle the line between rental and homeownership, and I know that that's kind of a hot button issue in a lot of communities that are considering changing their single family zoning policies, because there's this concern around gentrification. So I can talk a little bit about that. But probably the thing that distinguishes Dev Northwest from a lot of other developers is that our development is very intentional. So we are not a housing authority. We're not just trying to get low income or affordable housing units on the ground. We're also not a market rate developer. So we're not, interested in just kind of maximizing profits and sort of moving forward. Every one of our projects has some type of community focus. So for example, maybe we're trying to increase homeownership opportunities for BIPOC individuals and families, or we're trying to create more accessible housing for seniors that are trying to age in place, or veterans, or youth aging out of foster care. So we really try to find the areas in the market where no one's really doing that development, so that we can create those opportunities. As it's already been mentioned, asset building is the primary way that individuals build wealth in the United States. And through asset building, it's primarily through homeownership. So being able to transition from a rental to an owner is the way that we sort of work, individuals can sort of grow their equity. And as we all know, and have sort of heard probably ad nauseum by now, that because of exclusionary zoning and other policies, the people's wages are not increasing at the same rate that housing costs are. And so that's preventing individuals from being able to make that transition either through the rental market or into homeownership. And the lack of housing diversity and typologies is really a key player in that, because there's nowhere for folks to go. You can increase the affordable housing stock kind of as much as you want, but if individuals can't mobilize either up or down that real estate ladder effectively, you're going to always see that kind of bottleneck. That affordable housing crisis is always going to be there, and you're going to see those market gaps. So creating those typologies to kind of fill in those ladder rungs that are currently missing, to make it a bit more attainable for people to move up and down is really key, and that's really the heart of what Dev Northwest does. And really looking at the different types of resources and legislation available to be able to create those opportunities in the market. So just to kind of orient folks a little bit, just because I'm assuming most people are not familiar with Oregon geography. So up here is the Washington border. So Portland is about 20 minutes away from the Washington border. It's about 3 hours south of Seattle. Here's the ocean, here's a rainforest. Here's the I-5 corridor that connects Seattle to San Francisco, and then here's the Cascade Mountains. So the majority of the development in Oregon is in the Portland area and then along this I-5 corridor. So there's 4 big cities: Portland, Salem, which is the capital, Corvallis, and Eugene. And these are the 4 areas where Dev Northwest has offices. So our territory is basically along this entire corridor. So we currently have either existing assets or current development projects along this corridor. And just to relate it a little bit to Montgomery County, I would say that the Portland area is mostly similar to Area 1, maybe Area 2. Salem, Corvallis, and Eugene are probably a little closer to Area 2. And then kind of as you get towards the outskirts, you're getting more into Area 3, if you're just thinking about what these places kind of look like in terms of development. We do have a couple of projects out here on the coast, but those are a little bit harder for us to complete. So this is just an example of some of the missing middle typologies we currently have in play. These are just examples of sites that we've either just recently done since I came on board, or just right before. So this is a cottage cluster. This is a single family homeownership affordable development. These homes they range in size from about 800 square feet to 1,200 square feet, 1 to 3 bedrooms. These were sold to individuals at 60 to 80% of the area median income. So super proud of this housing product. This is kind of what Dev Northwest is really leading right now in the Oregon market. This is a duplex and a quad that's kind of connected to larger multifamily projects that we have that sort of exercise a variety of different typologies. And this is a hotel, a downtown hotel that was converted into ground floor retail, and above it, housing for seniors aging in place. So this is just to show kind of the range of different work that we're currently doing. Our current development pipeline includes over 100 affordable homes in cottage clusters and CLT subdivisions. So by CLT, I mean community land trust. So it's a shared ownership model, probably most familiar to the folks over at HUD. This has been a strategy that we've been able to kind of work through to be able to get some affordable homeownership in these communities. And then we also have 4 multifamily projects in our pipeline. One of those is a SRO co-living project for youth aging out of foster care. One is a similar co-living project, which is a downtown church redevelopment for vets. And then we have a neighborhood town center that we are including. It's truly a mixed-use site at its core. It's got commercial, residential, both affordable and market rate, as well as rental and homeownership. So we've got a multifamily project, and then we have a 28-unit market rate townhouse development going on in one of our urban areas. So those are the projects that we're currently working on. Because our projects are really focused on that 60% of the area median income to about 120% of the area median income, there aren't a lot of affordable housing products out there. Our capital stacks are pretty complex. So each project is pretty individual. We definitely leverage public funding. So we look at everything available at the local level, any state resources that we can get, and of course federal resources as well. So we integrate LIHTC, Home, CDBG, as well as a variety of other state-specific programs. We definitely pull in a lot of private financing, so we get bank loans, social impact investments. We have a lot of CDFI funding coming into our projects. CDFI is Community Development Financial Institutions, essentially just lending bodies for folks doing this type of work. And we do have some philanthropy, but not much, and we use a lot of our own portfolio revenue and equity to get these projects through. So we're really trying to be as creative as possible in leveraging funding sources that are available and working with local jurisdictions as well as the market. One of the most challenging things, I think, in terms of this typology is it's brand new. There just really aren't established funding tracks for these projects. And so we really have to kind of get into the weeds and start working with communities to make sure that we can get these projects through. I know that there's a concern. One of the concerns that I know I was hearing a lot when I was at Montgomery County, and I think has come up a few times even in this panel, is this idea that, you know, if you add density to an area, there's going to be this huge surge in development. And as a developer, that's just not the case. So I mean, a couple of things to kind of keep in mind is that just because you add density to an area, it doesn't necessarily lead to that densification. There are a variety of market barriers, environmental barriers, design barriers that prevent a site from being able to develop to its full density. And I think that anyone who's actually carried a project out knows that, you know, just because it says on paper that you can get a certain amount of units on a site, that's not always the case. And in fact, most of the time it's not the case. And so there is this concern that if you just sort of blanket, you know, increase the density somewhere, that you're going to see this surge. But I can tell you firsthand that that's just not how it happens. And that's not what we're seeing in Oregon either. I think in Minneapolis, it was the same thing. There definitely is an increased demand for these products, both on the developer side and on the community side, but there just will continue to be barriers, at least out of the gate. You're not going to see an immediate surge. At least that's not what we have seen here. One of the things that I really want to emphasize, and I think was said by a few different folks, I think there's a real fear around making some of these zoning changes, and folks come in and there are concerns, tons of concerns in all different areas. And I really encourage the county to kind of separate out what is a zoning issue, and then what are some other tools in our toolbox that we can use to pass legislation to help address some of those other concerns. So, for example, I know I'm sorry, I forgot your name, from Minneapolis. You mentioned that there were a variety of other policies. That was the same in Oregon. So the zoning policy is just one piece of it, but there are lots of legislative tools. There are funding tools and financing tools that can go in place alongside of this, that's outside the scope of just the zoning itself, that can be implemented alongside this change to help kind of alleviate and also steer what this change is going to look like in Montgomery County. So, for example, legislation was passed right around the same time in the same 2019 legislature that passed the HB 2001 bill. There was also a LIFT homeownership set aside. So our LIFT funding, our low income fast track rental housing, but bucket of funds for affordable housing was they designated a set aside for homeownership units, which coincided with this change. And so as a result of that, there is now a funding source available to developers like me who are able to come in and really develop these houses in an affordable way, and so that you can prevent that gentrification. There were also other local, the ability for local jurisdictions to be able to take the time to really figure out what the issues were in their areas. The Oregon legislator bifurcated that process so that the state as a whole said, this is our goal. Our goal is to be able to increase these housing typologies, but we recognize that parking is an issue. We'll recognize that infrastructure is an issue, but that's not the conversation we're having at the state level. So we're going to pass some minimum state levels, and then we're going to provide local jurisdictions with the time and the money that they need and the resources they need to educate and work with their communities to be able to study and analyze what the specific problems or issues are in areas, so that you could really tease out those two parts of the conversation. Because it's not, as it's already been said, moving in this direction, it's not a question of if it's moving in this direction, it's a question of when and how. And so if you can get folks to a point where you can have the conversation where this is the goal and this is the direction we're working in, but we will provide the time and the space and the resources to have those concerns addressed and worked through on more concrete issues, and you're able to pull in some of those other policies. That's really a key to be able to alleviate some of those community concerns, because infrastructure, parking, some of the land use issues, those are real concerns, and we've definitely seen them on the development front. It's been very challenging to get some of these projects through. I make a joke with our first community land trust project that we got through. I called it the first pancake. It was not pretty. It was edible, but it wasn't pretty. And we definitely had to work through some of those issues through when it came down to platting, legal, financing. It was pretty challenging. So I think using all of the tools in the toolbox, not just this one, trying to get this one policy passed that's going to address everything at once. And I think also just giving it the time and the space to do it. I would definitely underscore putting a deadline in. I think that giving folks a deadline to work for, to try to put some of these steps in process is also really key. And that worked really well in Oregon as well. So I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to take the development perspective. We're on the ground, we're building these units, and I'm happy to talk through more of our challenges and answer people's questions as they come.
Great. Thank you, Erin. We really appreciate you joining the panel to provide that perspective of someone actively trying to build what, at least in Montgomery County, is not a typical housing typology. The type of housing you are creating could certainly create more attainable options for households here in Montgomery County. And to real quickly clarify the geographic references that Erin made, Area 1 in Montgomery County refers to our more urbanized area inside the Beltway. Area 2 is our mid-county area that extends partly up the 270 corridor and captures many of our emerging urbanizing areas. And Area 3 includes our up-county and more rural parts of the county where with generally lower density development. So at this time, we're going to turn to our Q&A portion of the panel. As I mentioned earlier, we've prepared a few questions that came from staff as well as questions that we received from members of the community. We did receive a good number of questions, and we only have a limited amount of time remaining with our panelists, so we've tried to combine questions and prepare them in a way that will allow us to learn as much as possible from our panelists. That said, your presentations, I have to be honest, really touched on many of the questions that we had prepared. So I'll try to ask some that are a little more pointed and also invite our board to ask any questions that they may have. Commissioner Patterson, since you're joining us virtually this evening, just raise your hand in Teams if you have a question that you would like to ask. Okay, so I'm actually going to go right back to you, Erin, with our first question. Can you talk real quickly about the market demand for these smaller, more attainable housing typologies and whether the current market is actually meeting that demand?
Yeah, absolutely. So when talking about demand, you're talking about both like willingness and ability. Absolutely, there's demands for this. I mean, as we've already talked about, these units just don't exist, and so people's choice to move, whether they're talking about the rental side or the homeownership side, there's very few options, and the options that are available are often super competitive and also not attainable, particularly for communities of color and other communities that have not had the same type of access, particularly to things like down payments or ability to, that generational wealth gap is a significant issue. So yeah, there's definitely a demand for it. What we have seen on the development side is actually that a lot of our units that we've put in place now have been filled by seniors trying to age in place. We've seen a real uptick in that. We've also seen single parents and families without a dual income or folks who have faced a variety of challenges. And we've seen a lot of interest and have done a lot of engagement around equity and access. So trying to reach communities, particularly communities of color who have not had access to these housing resources in the past. So those are the areas where we're really seeing it. We're also seeing first-time home buyers, individuals who are sort of burdened by significant student loan debt, or individuals who have other housing constraints that they're unable, transportation costs that they're unable to save enough to move towards homeownership. So yeah, I would definitely say from a demand side, it's there, with the caveat again that there's definitely an interest from developers to try to find ways to use this legislation to improve development. But it's not like a big wave of development. It's really looking at certainly inside the urban growth boundary everywhere, because land is in short supply. But it's also looking at a lot of infill sites. And I would highlight that neighborhoods that have not seen a lot of revitalization or struggling neighborhoods, we're seeing some really positive interest in those neighborhoods, because now we can introduce housing typologies that will allow different types of funding sustainability over time. So in being able to, for instance, put a duplex in a neighborhood where otherwise maybe a single family home is just not a feasible product in that neighborhood, but a duplex very much could be. Somebody could live in one side, rent the other, or you see that multi-generational living. So yeah, we're definitely seeing an uptick, but I think it's in really positive ways, especially if you can help kind of pair the legislation with funding that helps support affordable housing alongside it. I think you see some really positive impacts on the demand.
Okay, and actually kind of sticking with that topic of demand, but from a slightly different perspective, I'd like to turn to Lisa. How much interest have you seen in Minneapolis for this type of product from the home building industry? And since your zoning updates took effect, have you seen a shift among some of the usual local home builders in the types of products that they build, or have you seen new players enter the market?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I showed you the numbers for duplexes and triplexes. A lot of those, very small multifamily have been conversions of existing buildings. Early on, the biggest wave that we saw was actually legalization of units that had been, in many cases, occupied illegally. They were older buildings, turn of the century Victorian type buildings that had, at some time been a duplex or triplex, but had lost their status and, because they had been vacant for a year or something like that. So anyway, there were a lot of conversions of units that were in existing buildings. We've had a handful of detached accessory dwelling units built. Those are pretty expensive to build, but there's some really great examples. They're beautiful, and there's some great examples of sort of multi-generational living in those. But the biggest change has actually been in that kind of smaller multifamily building. So 20 units, 30 units, 40 units, 50. We didn't see any market rate buildings of that size for decades in Minneapolis because they weren't legal to build. By the time you had our parking requirements, which before we started this journey, we had required 1 parking space per unit in new developments, that alone precluded the building of apartments of that scale, a 25-unit building or something of that size. So by reducing and then now finally eliminating parking requirements citywide, that change alone really opened up the possibility for these smaller scale multifamily buildings. And for me, I represent a ward that a lot of the buildings were built around that time, like early 1900s, both 4-story walk-ups and Victorian houses. And that scale of building is something that people really like, but we had made it illegal to build. And so it's really starting to match our rules to the outcomes that people want to see. So we also are seeing, bigger apartment buildings, 100 or 200 units. And I don't want to discount those. Those are important parts of our housing stock. But often people really prefer these smaller neighborhood scale buildings. And so by legalizing those through the multiple zoning changes, I think that has actually been the biggest shift that did open up the market for different kinds of developers. I had a gentleman in my ward who was an immigrant business owner. He owns a furniture store that caters to our local Somali community. And he actually developed his own parcel. He redeveloped his site. He was one of the inspirations for my first parking ordinance, because he couldn't build housing on his site with the way our parking requirements were. But now he has built housing over his new retail store in a new building. So we are starting to see more smaller developers, a greater diversity of developers. We also do own vacant land, mostly in what was single family neighborhoods from a variety of factors. There was a tornado and the foreclosure crisis. So we have also leveraged these policy changes with our own investments. So we're in parts of the city where we were helping very small developers or even individuals build new single family homes, we're now helping them build triplexes. And so a family in some of our lower income neighborhoods is not only getting a home and a pathway to home ownership, but also rental income opportunity by including those other 2 units in the same footprint. So we did not increase the size of allowed buildings. That would be a potential future step if we wanted to see more duplexes or triplexes. But for now, we kept that building envelope the same. So that's partly why progress has been slow in terms of the numbers of duplexes and triplexes.
Thank you, Lisa. And now to the rest of the panel, if you have thoughts on market demand, please share your thoughts on that here. But also, there's been some discussion about the tools beyond zoning that can be used to promote more diverse housing types. Are there specific policies or tools that you think are particularly important in expanding housing types? Are there tools that we should embrace here in Montgomery County? Are there certain pitfalls that we should avoid?
I'll go first. Why not? I think that there's an opportunity in the offsite construction industry. I mean, the demand is not there only because, the lack of knowledge and awareness about the benefits of, and when I say offsite construction, I mean housing that's built in a factory and then moved on site, assembled on site. Manufactured housing, modular housing. We're learning so much about these innovations in the industry and learning about how to address any market barriers or risks that developers or manufacturers of offsite construction products may confront. But we do see that there's some potential in the offsite / factory built housing arena. And I think that there are opportunities there that can be taken advantage of as we learn more and as we open up the market to different types of offsite construction, customizable housing that could be made available for particularly for moderate income families, the middle market.
I mentioned it in passing earlier, but I really do think that the renter protection policies that we have pursued were a really important part of this overall strategy. So we were making it easier to build housing. We're sort of deregulating our housing market in some ways. And to have that piece that really helped create more equity in how people are treated in the rental housing market was very critical for us. We have our state laws around renter protections are not strong in Minnesota. So it pushed a lot of pressure on us at the local level. But I think, when we think about, how are we creating healthy communities where folks have opportunity and access? If people are struggling to stay stably housed in rental housing, or if folks are acquiring eviction records, it is such a huge barrier for, intergenerational and community stability. So for us to put in those layers of really leveraging every single tool we could think of with our licensing function when we license rental housing, as well as to interact in the rental market more than we had in the past, including considering the inspired by Oregon and California, the rent stabilization policies, where we say, you know what, landlords can increase their rent by by an amount, but not infinity, not 10% a year, where families are being displaced, where kids in our schools are losing their community, where, folks who've lived in the neighborhood for 20 years all of a sudden are faced with a giant price increase with nowhere to go. It's hugely destabilizing. And so I really think those renter protections were an important piece of the overall puzzle for us.
So I'm just going to real quickly point out that it's 7:28, and I just wanted to see if it's okay with the panel and with our board if we can kind of extend a little bit longer. I'm just looking to see if we have some nodding heads even from our panel, maybe 15 minutes or so. Okay. So I wanted to see if I could ask, kind of change the topic a little bit here. In Montgomery County, there's been some community concern that changes to allow more housing types in single-family zones will lead to gentrification and displacement of existing residents. I'd like to see if any of you share that concern and what safeguards can be put in place to ensure that the benefits of attainable housing are equitably dispersed. We can open this up to all the panelists, but I think I'd like to actually start with Regina on this. I know you've done a great deal of research in the affordable housing arena, including from a preservation perspective. Do you have any thoughts on this issue of gentrification?
We're doing some research on gentrification. Me, not myself, but a lot of my colleagues or some of my colleagues in other divisions, and trying to learn more about displacement policies, especially since some of the work we're doing around, I don't know if the council is familiar with the rental assistance demonstration work. And as we have this portfolio of public housing that is in great need of repair, these are old buildings and also multifamily project-based housing. That when we're starting to make improvements to these developments, they're sometimes, not always, but sometimes there's displacement. We need to do more in the arena in the gentrification space, because I think that there are some questions about sort of the right mix. What is a community that allows for different incomes, household types? What's the right mix? And I think that varies from community to community. Yeah, that is a very, very tough question. That is a very tough question. But one thing that we can do more of, as some of the recommendations that we're getting from the public and from other communities around the country, is provide more assistance in the consolidated planning process. And so helping communities, providing sort of capacity building around comprehensive planning, and doing more in the area of helping communities determine long range or forecasting development models as we get, as our population changes and settlement patterns. We see a lot of that going on. And do more helping communities plan for the future, doing more in sort of forecasting land and, where there's scarce land, where there's vacancies and underutilized parcels of land that could be repositioned or repurposed for affordable housing, and making housing of all different types, whether it's, single family detached, multifamily 5 to 9, what have you. Actually, I think Montgomery County is doing a good job of that.
Lisa, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit from the Minneapolis perspective. Has gentrification been an issue that you've had to think about there, or have you seen? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think there's a few kind of themes I would emphasize with this. The first is that gentrification is happening as our status quo, absent any change. And so we know if we froze all development in our city right now, gentrification would be extraordinarily worse because the demand for our city is growing. People are moving here, attracted by the high quality of life, very similar to your community. And so we know that if we just left things all the same, gentrification would be running rampant. That is what has been happening leading up to all of this work. I do think it's really important to track our progress over time. I think often we think of zoning changes as like they're etched in stone because they're so hard to do. They're emotional. People are emotional about their communities and where they live. We try to be really thoughtful and data driven. I mean, your staff are doing incredible work. It is thoughtful and time consuming work, but it's also okay to adjust it. It's okay to adjust it in 6 months or a year, which is like insanely quick in turnaround in the planning world. But I think we have to get a little bit more comfortable with, we try something, maybe we didn't go far enough. I think our inclusionary zoning ordinance, for example, was pretty conservative. And we're already seeing ways that it could be adjusted. We tried to set a fee higher so that we would get on-site units, but a lot of developers are still paying a fee. So, we could adjust it and tweak it. And we don't have to wait 10 years to make that kind of adjustment. So I think those are two things that I think were really important lessons for us. Number one, we just have to remember the status quo isn't working for the vast majority of our community. And number two, that it's okay to move incrementally, but also then revisit the policy and make tweaks and changes as you learn and track your progress over time.
I think that is a good reminder about what the status quo is getting us. So Kelly, I'm going to shift over to you here. We have heard a lot of concerns from residents in Montgomery County, including questions that we received in anticipation of this panel about the potential negative impacts of adding more housing types on infrastructure and parking. And so I'm curious if you've heard a lot of the similar concerns in Arlington and how you are responding to those concerns. And I know that you're in the middle of all of this as we are at this time. So.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. So, being right across the river from you, and it probably doesn't matter what community you live in in the country, you would hear similar concerns about the impacts of growth and quality of life. We hear a lot about environmental concerns as well. So parking is a big one, but also, what are the impacts of expanding housing choice on our tree canopy? If we allow more housing choice, will this spur more development? Will this lead to even more loss of pervious surface and greater stormwater management concerns? So, it was very important as part of our phase one effort to document these concerns and just kind of create that space for people to be able to share those thoughts. And then what we're doing now in phase two is evaluating these housing types through the lens of those priorities and concerns. So how can we, in the design of these different housing types, best balance like the priorities and the concerns? So from a parking perspective, how can we leverage proximity to transit? And Arlington has, we are blessed with excellent, transit access. So how do we leverage that access to the metro corridors, to our bus lines, to provide, some opportunities for, parking flexibility, perhaps, that can, stimulate, or provide the space for some housing options that otherwise might not be possible. In terms of, tree canopy and stormwater management, I think it's important to make sure that we communicate the message that, any housing development would be subject to, our mandatory requirements for stormwater management, for tree canopy coverage. It's no different from what is already expected in terms of single family development. And we will, through the study, I think, be looking for ways, to try to create identify some creative solutions to perhaps move the needle on how we do achieve those goals. So we are still in the middle of our analysis, but I think that through our recommendations, we're going to be trying to see how we can best address those concerns, because they are valid concerns and important to talk about through this process.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm going to actually turn now to our new vice chair as a question.
Thank you, everyone, for participating tonight. Dr. Regina Gray and Kelly Brown and Erin Day and Lisa Bender, you guys have all been incredible. And I think, what's interesting with everything that's being said is that we all share the same stories. And, in a strange way, this has been a little bit of a therapy session for me, because I think when we're all in the midst of these kind of transformational changes, because that's really what they are. These kind of conversations are not easy. And, in many sophisticated jurisdictions, a lot of analysis is required. You have constituents that are very sophisticated. You have, government officials that want to make sure that they're doing it in a deliberative manner. Some of the things that are being said about even just the way, for instance, Arlington County has framed this effort of missing middle as expanding housing choice. Just those words really kind of resonate. But then also in Minneapolis, gentrification is already happening. The status quo is not working. Those kind of narratives, I think, are so powerful because they really capture the essence of what we're trying to do here. And it's not easy work. I did have a question for Dr. Regina Gray, because I do think, particularly in Montgomery County, where we often do look to the federal government for assistance, we obviously have a big federal government presence here. And I think Arlington can also attest to this, that I think sometimes, there are some of these, resistance to new ideas or changes, but then in the workplace, whether we're working for a federal agency, or even in a private sector, we're constantly changing the way we do business. We're constantly adapting. However, in the world of land use, that's often comes with some sort of resistance because, people aren't sure what it's going to look like. So I guess my question for Dr. Gray is, has HUD come out with, or can they come out with, some sort of larger guidance? I mean, I know there's been some, executive kind of resolutions and larger proclamations by the Biden administration on how we need more housing and we need different kind of housing types. But I sometimes wonder if it would be helpful for an entity like HUD to basically say, look, we know that these kind of issues are happening all over the country. And these are the guidance that we kind of recommend with jurisdictions on how to deal with increasing your different housing typologies, how to ensure that we have a diverse housing type and that allows for a more dynamic environment for all of our communities and on an equitable basis. And I really feel like in Montgomery County that would go a long way, because I think a lot of people are constantly looking for that kind of affirmation of sorts where they can look to a larger entity and say, okay, look, this is kind of coming down from the federal government, because I feel like even though we're all required to go through our own processes legally because of the way, whether it's a land use article or however our governments are structured, I do think that if the federal government created a more established framework for some of these policies, that we would have potentially, we're always going to have resistance, but you potentially would have more people have a buy-in of sorts that we currently don't have. So I was just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Very difficult question, but thank you so much for asking. We're going through that process now. I should say that when we embarked on beginning to look internally at our own departmental programs and policies and practices, what could we do with FHA, for example, to sort of making sure that our programs are, the way they're implemented, the way they're enforced, don't have an unintended consequence of exacerbating inequities and disparities. So we're going through the exercise now that we have this big regulatory barriers initiative that we're looking at, and we're looking to the local and state examples to sort of help us work through how if we were going to incentivize efforts based on best practices at the local and state level, what would that look like? Because we're not a super zoning entity, of course, everybody knows that. So our goal is to figure out how we can better incentivize communities to adopt more equitable land use practices, even down to addressing things like design standards, subdivision design requirements and design standards, and how even, having maximum lot sizes or maximum density requirements or restrictions price out families who who would not be able to afford to live in certain communities because of those types of standards. So the best answer that I can provide to you is that we're doing that work based on recommendations that we have received across all federal agencies, because all federal agencies were charged to look at their own internal programs, policies, and practices and see where some of their practices or programs could be streamlined. So, for example, or at least reviewed. So, for example, EPA's sort of brownfield mitigation practices. How can we better sort of reduce the time or look at strategies for standardizing or streamlining the environmental review process, for example. At the federal level, I mentioned the consolidated planning process and other tools that I can't currently share with you now because it's an internal sort of development process in the conceptual phase. But I can say that the work is being done to develop guidance that we think will be useful for the communities, not only the communities that receive, grant funds like CDBG or home investment funds or a number of our programs, funding programs that are geared towards improving neighborhoods, Choice Neighborhoods program, for example. But what we can do to really incentivize local and state governments to adopt more equitable practices. And I'm sorry, I can't give you more explicit example, but I can say that some of that work developing guidance is ongoing and is happening now.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you. And I think in the meantime, before you come out with that, we may have to just have you give presentations to stakeholders and maybe even our various government entities, because I think when I hear it from what's happening on the federal level, that resonates with people, because what you're seeing is not only, in certain, metropolitan regions, you're seeing it all over the country. And that perspective, I think, when it comes from HUD, really resonates. So be forewarned, I will be emailing you because I do think your perspective is invaluable. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
Okay, so I just wanted to see if there were any final thoughts or questions from the board. Of course, I have to tell you, I've got at least a dozen more questions that we could be asking you all. I think that this has been a fantastic panel, but I want to see if we have any other final thoughts or questions.
Jerry Turkey. I grew
Yep,
up
you
in
got
duplexes in different areas of the country. South Boston, Jersey City. Grew up in a housing project in Jersey City, which was great. I bought a home in less time than my parents took them to buy a home. But we have, and maybe Aaron is familiar, in where our old office was in Silver Spring, to the northwest side of Spring Street and Georgia Avenue, we have provided where you can go in and rezone areas that maybe in the R90, 120 range. We do a great job up county where it's new land. We require a mix of housing. When we do apartment buildings, there's affordable homes that are required. But this is a situation where a developer can come in. I'd say the homes are maybe 700,000 to 800,000. Could offer a kind of inflated price to the homeowner. Then come in and tell us, okay, you provided us in this particular zone, and if I'm wrong, correct it. But you can make 4 lots in there, and you can build some homes. Maybe let's say he's paid $1 million for the lot, so it's 250,000 in ground value. Build some 4 units in there. Is that workable, and what happens to the abutting units, the abutting single-family homes? Do they follow suit, or does the developer come in and say, well, I'm only going to offer you 700,000 for the lot, really depressing what's available there? Is that situation existed anywhere, Minneapolis, Oregon, or Arlington? Have you seen that happen? So it kind of disrupts the whole value of the properties.
Yeah, we've seen that a little bit in Oregon, where they're especially in actually the neighborhood where I live is kind of primed for that right now. I live within walking distance of downtown.
Right. Silver Spring is that way.
Larger lots, absolutely, sort of super primed for that. I think it's obviously possible. I think that one of the just taking the slightly more practical side as a developer. There are lots of things that can be done to help kind of level the playing field in terms of implementation. So whether you're trying to curb gentrification or you're trying to just kind of level the playing field and see how these kind of play out in action, I think there are various things that could be put into place to help kind of curb that process once legislation has been passed, right? So beyond the zoning. So for example, doing things or putting pieces in place to help support affordable developers, for example, who are coming in and giving them the process can be pretty tedious and pretty expensive. With every single missing middle site that I have done so far, it has resulted in me sitting down with the planning department and negotiating a slew of policies to try to fit these typologies in. So even though the legislation's there, the zoning may be there, sort of sitting there trying to work through platting requirements and utility bonding requirements and fees and all of these other things. And if those other supports aren't in place for affordable developers to come in, or for existing residents, right, for current residents to come in and be able to do that, and those tools and those resources and some of those supports aren't in place, then you probably will see more developers coming in because they have greater capacity to do that. They have greater capacity to kind of problem solve and resources. So I think that the issue isn't to slow down the zoning or the policy. That's not the answer. The answer is to look at the process in place and then say, how is this actually being implemented? And what can we do to ensure that our goals, whether they're equity goals or gentrification goals or whatever goals that we have in place, what can we do to make sure that playing field is level and is actually accomplishing the goals that we set apart? And that's outside of the zoning. And I think that often gets merged in these conversations. So I would say, yes, it can happen. And there are many ways that Montgomery County can put things in place so that that type of behavior or that type of market behavior isn't seen as often.
All right, thank you.
In Minneapolis, just quickly, our property values are skyrocketing across the city. So if anything, what we're hearing is people concerned about their property taxes rising along with it because of how we levy for taxes. And the second thing I wanted to say was I actually think one of the biggest, sort of from a policy or political standpoint, one of the biggest changes that we made in practice is because we took this citywide approach and then we upzoned the city. We did a overlay in our zoning district and we actually implemented the plan, within a pretty tight time frame. We removed a project by project approval process that was happening for new apartment buildings. So back before the comprehensive plan and these zoning changes, if you wanted to build a 6-story apartment building along transit in Minneapolis, you actually had to go through a highly political process because so many projects required variances and conditional use permits and special permissions. They would go to the planning commission. Well, they would go to the neighborhood organization for many meetings, sometimes over months, even stretching into a couple of years. In our high income, high capacity neighborhoods, there'd be a debate between residents who were lawyers or architects, which didn't happen in the lower income neighborhoods where people didn't have as much time or resources or education or professional training. And so we were seeing, number one, a very highly political process with a lot of pressure on planning commissioners and council members to basically design each and every apartment building that was being approved in our city. You saw a lot of uncertainty in the market because of that. It's partly what drove us to have a small number of very large developers instead of a diversity of more smaller developers. Yeah. And it also, for a homeowner or for any property owner, now I think there is a huge benefit to the level of predictability that you have, because we have said, on this parcel, you can go up to 6 stories, or if you do certain things, you can go up to 10 stories. And that's it. You just know, because it's an adopted plan, it's citywide. Of course, it could change over time, but instead of being this highly political project by project process, it's now more, there's more certainty.
Good. Thank you.
So I want to take a second to thank each of you, Dr. Regina Gray, Lisa Bender, Kelly Brown, Erin Day. It's just been fantastic to have each of you here this evening. And I would kind of echo our vice chair's comments and say, don't be surprised if we reach out to any one of you to get more, from your experiences. And I think there's a lot for us to learn from each other. And likewise, we're happy here in Montgomery County to share our experiences. And I think that, Lisa, you talked about learning about planning in Montgomery County when you were going through your grad school program. And I think that, Montgomery County strives to really be on the forefront with a lot of our planning policies and our approaches to planning. And I think that with what we're doing here, there are opportunities to do that, as well as with Thrive Montgomery 2050, our update to the general plan. So looking forward to the months ahead. I think we've got some good things to look forward to here with our policy work. So I'm going to thank you all and turn it over to the vice chair to adjourn us.
Thank you so much, Jason, and all the planning staff. It's been a long day, but ending it with these 4 very inspiring speakers is a perfect way to end a long day. So with that, we are adjourned.